Hitler's greatest strategic disadvantage in opposing the Allies' imminent re-entry into Europe lay in the immense stretch of Germany's conquests, from the west coast of France to the east coast of Greece. It was difficult for him to gauge where the Allies would strike next. The Allies' greatest strategic advantage lay in the wide choice of alternative objectives, and in the powers of distraction they enjoyed through their superior sea power. Hitler, while always having to guard against a cross-channel invasion from England's shores, had cause to fear that the Anglo-American armies in North Africa might land anywhere on his southern front between Spain and Greece. Allied landing in Europe and the defeat of the Axis power. Let's know what is Allied power. Allied powers, coalition of countries that oppose the Axis powers, led by Germany, Italy, and Japan during World War II. The principal members of the Allies were the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, the United States, and China, the Big Four, as well as France while it was unoccupied. The Allies also included every other signatory to the Declaration by United Nations, January 1, 1942 Australia, Belgium, Canada, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Greece, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, India, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Nicaragua, Norway, Panama, Poland, South Africa, and Yugoslavia. Later wartime signers were Mexico, the Philippines, Ethiopia, Iraq, Brazil, Bolivia, Iran, Colombia, Liberia, France, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Paraguay, Venezuela, Uruguay, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Lebanon. The Allies began as an agreement between Poland, the United Kingdom, and France that the latter two would come to Poland's aid if it were invaded by Germany. When Germany did attack on September 1, 1939, the United Kingdom and France fulfilled their promise, declaring war against Germany on September 3. The independent British dominions of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa followed the United Kingdom's lead, declaring war either that same day or a few days later. Denmark and Norway joined the Allies the next year when Germany invaded both countries on April 9, 1940. So too did the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg that May, once Germany repeated its World War I strategy of moving its forces through those countries to invade France. All these new partnerships were short-lived, however, as Germany swiftly conquered each country. The same sequence of events would play out again in southeastern Europe. Greece and Yugoslavia joined the Allies on October 28, 1940, and April 6, 1941, respectively, but were soon occupied. With France surrendering on June 22, 1940, the United Kingdom and its former colonies were effectively the only Allies in action for over a year, from mid-1940 to mid-1941. It was on June 22, 1941, that the British received an unexpected gift, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This attack resulted in an Anglo-Soviet treaty on July 12, 1941, and unlike the smaller nations that had been so quickly overrun by the German war machine, the Soviet Union was capable of not only surviving its initial ambush, but also helping the Allied cause beyond its own borders, e.g., invading Iran to ensure that its oil could not be used to fuel Axis vehicles. With support from the American Lend-Lease program, the Soviet Union became a nightmare for the German military. Eventually, its forces would push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. On December 7th, December 8th in Asia, 1941, Japan attacked American, British, and Dutch military bases in the Pacific, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. For reasons still debated today, Germany declared war on the United States as well on December 11th. Where once the United States had participated in the war only as a source of arms and other supplies for the Allies, serving as what press Franklin D. Roosevelt memorably called an arsenal of democracy. These aggressions brought it fully into the Allied fold. The attacks were perhaps the Axis powers' greatest mistake. As in World War I, U.S. production capacity dwarfed that of any other country with which it was allied or fought. By the end of the war, the U.S. would produce almost two-thirds of all the Allies' military equipment. The U.S. also had the population to contribute a large number of troops, mobilizing over 16 million, more than any other Allied power save the Soviet Union. Where the U.S. went, much of the Western Hemisphere followed. Countries that immediately declared war on members of the Axis powers in the wake of Japan's attack included Costa Rica, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, and Panama. Brazil joined on August 22, 1942, Mexico on May 22, 1942. Bolivia became an official member as well on April 7, 1943, but its government was overthrown in a coup shortly thereafter. After this new influx of partners, the Allied roster remained mostly stable until near the end of the war. Countries liberated from Axis occupation renewed their membership in the Allies. In 1945, the inaugural meeting of the United Nations, formerly called the United Nations Conference on International Organization, UNCIO, led a number of previously neutral countries, such as Saudi Arabia, to join the Allies, as the organizing countries made allying with them against the Axis a precondition for attending. The Allies therefore ended the war with 47 member states, all of which would become charter members of the United Nations, when that body's charter was signed on June 26, 1945. Having failed to save its forces in Tunisia, the Axis had only 10 Italian divisions of various sorts and 2 German panzer units stationed on the island of Sicily at midsummer 1943. The Allies, meanwhile, were preparing to throw some 478,000 men into the island, 150,000 of them in the first 3 days of the invasion. Under the supreme command of Alexander, Montgomery's British 8th Army and Patton's U.S. 7th Army were to be landed on 2 stretches of beach 40 miles long, 20 miles distant from one another, the British in the southeast of the island, the Americans in the south. The Allies' air superiority in the Mediterranean theater was so great by this time, more than 4,000 aircraft against some 1,500 German and Italian ones, that the Axis bombers had been withdrawn from Sicily in June to bases in north-central Italy. On July 10, Allied seaborne troops landed on Sicily. The coastal defenses, manned largely by Sicilians unwilling to turn their homeland into a battlefield for the Germans' sake, collapsed rapidly enough. The British forces had cleared the whole southeastern part of the island in the first 3 days of the invasion. The Allies' drive toward Messina then took the form of a circuitous movement by the British around Mount Etna in combination with an eastward drive by the Americans, who took Palermo, on the western half of the northern coast, on July 22. Meanwhile, the German armored strength in Sicily had been reinforced. A few days after the fall of Mussolini, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander-in-chief in Italy, decided that the Axis troops in Sicily must be evacuated. The local Italian commander thought so too. While rearguard actions held up the Allies at Adrano, on the western face of Mount Etna, and at Randazzo, to the north, 40,000 Germans and 60,000 Italian troops were safely withdrawn across the Strait of Messina to the mainland, mostly in the week ending on August 16, 1943, the day before the Allies' entry into Messina. The Allies sustained about 22,800 casualties in their conquest of Sicily. The Axis powers suffered about 165,000 casualties, of whom 30,000 were Germans. The success of the Sicilian operation and the fall of Mussolini converted the American military and political leadership into supporters of a campaign in Italy. Furthermore, Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Morgan, who after Casablanca had been designated Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, Cossack, produced a detailed and realistic plan for the long-envisaged invasion of France from Great Britain, thus enabling the U.S. strategists to calculate more precisely how much of the Allies' resources were needed for that purpose, and how much could be spared for operations in the Mediterranean and for the Pacific. With regard to the Pacific, plans sponsored by Admiral Nimitz for operations against the Gilbert and Marshall Islands apart from the enterprise against Rabaul were approved early in August 1943. The new turn of strategical thought necessitated a new Anglo-US conference, which took place in Quebec in mid-August 1943 and was codenamed Quadrant. After vigorous debate, the question of the timing of Overlord was eventually left open, but it was agreed that the strength of the assault force should exceed the original estimate by 25%, that the cross-channel landing should be supported by a landing in southern France, and that a U.S. officer should be in command of Overlord. It was also decided that a new Southeast Asia theater of war should be organized, under British command. Channel landings support France against Germans. The airborne troops were the vanguard, and their landings were a heartening success. The American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, dropping into a deliberately inundated zone at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula, suffered many casualties by drowning but nevertheless secured their objective. The British 6th Airborne Division seized its unflooded objectives at the eastern end more easily, and its Special Task Force also captured key bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River. When the seaborne units began to land about 6:30 a.m. on June 6, the British and Canadians on Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches overcame light opposition. So did the Americans at Utah. The U.S. 1st Division at Omaha Beach, however, confronted the best of the German coast divisions, the 352nd, and was roughly handled by machine gunners as the troops waded ashore. During the morning, the landing at Omaha threatened to fail. Only dedicated local leadership eventually got the troops inland, though at a cost of more than 2,000 casualties. After the landing of Southern Germany's response. Meanwhile, the German High Command, in the absence of Rommel, who was home on leave, began to respond. Hitler was initially unwilling to release the armored divisions for a counterattack. When he relented after midday, elements of the 21st Panzer Division drove into the gap between the British 3rd and Canadian 3rd Divisions at Sword Beach and Juno Beach and almost reached the sea. Had they done so, the landings might have failed. Fierce resistance by British anti-tank gunners at Perrier-sur-Lodan turned the tide in late evening. On June 7 the beachhead consisted of 3 separate sectors, that of the British and Canadians, between Caen, not taken, and Bayeux, that of the U.S. V Corps, between Port-Moresby and Saint-Pierre-du-Mont, and that of the U.S. 7 Corps, west of the Vire River behind Utah Beach. The narrow gap between Gold and Omaha at Port-Moresby was quickly closed, but it was not until June 12 that the American Corps were able to join hands after a bitter battle to capture Corentin. The beachhead then formed a continuous zone, its deepest point being southwest of Bayeux, where the V Corps had driven nearly 15 miles, 25 kilometers, inland. Meanwhile, work had been proceeding pell-mell to complete 2 artificial harbors, known by their code name, Mulberry, that were intended to offload vehicles and supplies until the port of Cherbourg was secured. An outer breakwater of sunken ships for each harbor was in place by June 11. Floating piers, designed to rise and fall with the tides, were half finished by June 19, when a heavy storm destroyed much of the material. The Americans then decided to abandon their mulberry, while the British harbor was not in use until July. Most supplies meanwhile had to be beach-landed by assorted landing craft, landing ships, and amphibious trucks, dukus. Fighting inshore, the Allies also encountered difficulty in the dense hedgerow country known to the French as the bocage. Thanks to the success of the airborne landings, the flanks of the beachhead were firmly held, but efforts to break out of the center were frustrated by fierce German resistance and counterattacks, particularly around Caen in the British-Canadian sector. A British armored thrust at Villers-Bocage was defeated on June 13. A large-scale infantry offensive west of Caen, called Operation Epsom, was also defeated on June 25 to 29. There was gloom at SHAF. It seemed that stalemate was descending. The gloom was deepened by Montgomery's strategy. His plan was to draw German armor toward the British front and win a battle of attrition between tank forces. The successful German defense, however, led the Americans to doubt the plan's viability. In fact, the Germans were also depressed, for their bitter defense was using up men and equipment that could not be replaced. Moreover, the Americans were now able to profit from the deployment of most of the enemy's armor against the British and break into the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and advance on Cherbourg. The last bastion in the heavily fortified city fell on June 28, and clearance of the port began at once. Crisis in the Germans' command after landing of Southern. The setbacks brought about a crisis in the German High Command, which in any case now suffered unforeseeable casualties. Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army, died suddenly on June 28, just after the surrender of the main garrison in Cherbourg. His death was blamed on a heart attack, though it is quite likely he committed suicide. Rommel was severely injured when his car was strafed by a British fighter on July 17. Worst of all, Rundstedt confessed defeatism to Hitler, urged him to make peace, and was dismissed on July 2 along with Gere, the commander of Panzer Group West. Gere was replaced by the capable veteran Heinrich Eberbach. Rundstedt himself was replaced by Gunther von Kluge, who soon came round to sharing Rundstedt's doubts. On July 20, a conspiracy of officers, including former Army Chief of Staff Ludwig Beck and Reserve Army Chief of Staff Claus, Count Schenk von Stauffenberg, who believed the only hope of securing a peace lay in Hitler's removal, made an attempt on his life at his East Prussian headquarters, Rassenburg. The failure of the July plot led to Hitler's taking draconian powers over the army and exacting terrible revenge on those suspected of complicity. Rommel was forced to commit suicide in October, and Kluge did so on August 18. The German defense of Normandy had by then taken a turn for the worse. Though a large British armored offensive west of Caen, Operation Goodwood, failed on July 18 to 19, the U.S. First Army conducted a bitter battle of attrition around Saint-Lô in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of July. Its success was to lay the basis for the long-awaited breakout. The Allies' invasion of Italy and the Italian volte-face, 1943. From Sicily, the Allies had a wide choice of directions for their next offensive. Calabria, the toe of Italy, was the nearest and most obvious possible destination, and the shin was also vulnerable, and the heel was also very attractive. The two Army Corps of Montgomery's 8th Army crossed the Strait of Messina and landed on the toe of Italy on September 3, 1943. But, though the initial resistance was practically negligible, they made only very slow progress, as the terrain, with only two good roads running up the coasts of the Great Calabrian Toe, prevented the deployment of large forces. On the day of the landing, however, the Italian government at last agreed to the Allies' secret terms for a capitulation. It was understood that Italy would be treated with leniency in direct proportion to the part that it would take, as soon as possible, in the war against Germany. The capitulation was announced on September 8. The landing on the Shin of Italy at Salerno, just south of Naples, was begun on September 9 by the MixU.S. British Fifth Army under U.S. General Mark Clark. Transported by 700 ships, 55,000 men made the initial assault, and 115,000 more followed up. At first they were faced only by the German 16th Panzer Division, but Kesselring, though he had only 8 weak divisions to defend all southern and central Italy, had had time to plan since the fall of Mussolini and had been expecting a blow at the Shin. His counterstroke made the success of the Salerno landing precarious for 6 days, and it was not until October 1 that the Fifth Army entered Naples. By contrast, the much smaller landing on the heel of Italy, which had been made on September 2, the day preceding the invasion of the Toe, took the Germans by surprise. Notwithstanding the paucity of its strength in men and in equipment, the expedition captured 2 good ports, Taranto and Brindisi, in a very short time, but it lacked the resources to advance promptly. Nearly a fortnight passed before another small force was landed at Bari, the next considerable port north of Brindisi, to push thence unopposed into Foggia. It was the threat to their rear from the heel of Italy and from Foggia that had induced the Germans to fall back from their positions defending Naples against the Fifth Army. When the Italian government, in pursuance of a Badaglio Eisenhower agreement of September 29, declared war against Germany on October 13, 1943, Kesselring was already receiving reinforcements and consolidating the German hold on central and northern Italy. The Fifth Army was checked temporarily on the Volturno River, only 20 miles north of Naples, then more lastingly on the Garigliano River, while the Eighth Army, having made its way from Calabria up the Adriatic coast, was likewise held on the Sangro River. Autumn and midwinter passed without the Allies making any notable impression on the Germans' Gustav Line, which ran for 100 miles from the mouth of the Garigliano through Cassino and over the Apennines to the mouth of the Sangro. Don't forget subscribe the channel, and coming next interesting and attractive historical stories, how soldiers never lose this courage. Thank for watching, and hearing meet again.